I'm Steve Coll. I'm the author of Private Empire, ExxonMobil American Power. Wear lots of other hats too, but that's the main one at the moment. The book is a kind of investigative narrative history of ExxonMobil and its place in public life here and abroad from the time of the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989 through to basically the present day. I it took some doing to try to understand what mattered at this company and why it matters to us. And one of the transformational events in its own life was that spill. It destroyed their reputation overnight. It led to a series of pretty radical reforms inside the company on a never again basis. One of the conclusions I came to about ExxonMobil was that it was useful to think of it as a kind of independent sovereign state spread around the world. And if you think of it as a country, the Valdez spill was kind of a 9/11 event for them. So they really overreacted to some extent, but also were galvanized through and through by that accident. I didn't go in a straight line to this book. I have been working on subjects that have to do with America's sort of asymmetric power in the world, particularly in a post 9/11 setting. And after doing the book before this one, which was basically about modernization in Saudi Arabia and all of the complicated ways that Saudi society produced not just Osama bin Laden, but his 53 brothers and sisters who had wildly different sources of global identity. I came out of that book about Saudi Arabia and I really wanted to write about oil. And oil in an age of limits, oil in an age of contest, oil as a proxy for America's place in the world, as a source of struggle. I had been inspired as a younger journalist by The Prize by Dan Jurgen, which is a large historical, well-reported narrative. It's sort of about oil in the age of expansion and discovery, and I wanted to write about oil in an age of limits and change. So I actually started out this book without ExxonMobil as the particular focus, and I was going to write a wider narrative about America and oil in the modern era. And I got out into the field about 6 months, and I thought, I really need a company to tell this story properly. I'm too spread out. So once I made that decision, that ExxonMobil was the only logical choice because they're the largest corporation headquartered in the United States. They receive very little scrutiny. They have a very strong culture, a very particular sense of themselves. They're a very closed institution, which makes them both difficult to report on and kind of intriguing as a project. And so off I went. And as I got going, I would just say that I was very glad that I had chosen them because they're a very powerful subject in lots of ways. But also, I came to think of the book a little bit differently than when I started out. I came to think of it as a case study of corporate sovereignty and power in our political economy and in the world's political economy. We live in a time when I think governments matter less, and non-governmental entities are rising in importance. Technological change is a factor, globalization is a factor. And in the United States, corporations are more influential, I would argue, than at any time since the Gilded Age. You can measure this statistically. Corporate income relative to household income, relative to small business income, is greater than it's been at any time since people started keeping statistics about such things. And we know intuitively, whether you're coming at it from the Tea Party or the Occupy side, that income inequality is related to the role that corporations play in our politics and the degree of industry capture that's emerged in sections of our government. And so if that's the context, well, ExxonMobil is a very interesting example because their revenue last year was greater than the economic activity of most countries in the world. But as journalists, we don't really scrutinize them very much. Mostly that they were a very closed institution, very disciplined. They don't volunteer to be written about. They didn't want to be written about here. I it's my professional life to write about hard subjects, so I have a method. But even as I applied my method, I found that their walls were thicker, and they were just a tighter subject. Now, there are ways you can break down a corporation like ExxonMobil as a reporter. In this society, one example is court records, which they sue a lot of people. They get sued by a lot of people. Some of those cases go to trial. The records that are generated there, the testimony that is generated there, while selective, can be very revealing. And there are some trial narratives in the book that help kind of go down layers of depth that it wouldn't be possible for me to do without their cooperation while interviewing. I also filed extensive Freedom of Information Act requests with the United States government, looking at places abroad where I knew they operated and where I knew the country was troubled, so there had to be an interesting story there. So it was a little bit like throwing a message in a bottle into the State Department and other sections of the government, asking for cables that would describe ExxonMobil's activity in periods of violence in Aceh, Indonesia, for example, in Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, and those efforts actually, over time, yielded very, very strong material. And then I interviewed. I interviewed as many people as I could find. I approached the company directly. They provided a limited amount of background cooperation. I came later to understand that they probably thought they were being exceptionally cooperative, but my experience was that it was helpful, but pretty limited. Yeah, there's a kind of outside-in process that's a little bit like that, and I try to. What I feel like I've learned, just as a journalist over 30 years of doing this, is that there's really no one method. You kind of have to do everything. If the target is really hard, if it's really hard, you just have to surround it with every method of effective reporting that you know how to conduct. You do them all simultaneously, and then follow the threads that open up. And outside in, though, that notion of interpolating your way forward is the basic framework. There are moments when a door opens and you go straight in, and you stay in that hallway or that room that you've gotten into until you've emptied it. And then you try to find another door to go through. If you don't, you back out and look for another way. Well, it's mostly interview breakthroughs are the big serendipitous kind of mapping aspects. There are lots of ways to try to approach people to ask them to help you, even if the corporation's official position is we're not cooperating. So you look for people who are former executives or who may not be afraid to talk about the company. One thing that was particularly difficult about ExxonMobil is that it's a very comfortable place to work if you can abide their rules and their culture. It's a place where many people stay for life. They have an excellent defined benefit pension plan, and they tie everyone up with non-disclosure agreements that are tied to the retirement benefits. So people really feel like they have skin in the game. If they're accused of violating the non-disclosure agreements, they could put their entire retirement at risk. So that makes people cautious in a way that you wouldn't normally find. But look, I wasn't asking anyone to turn over their secret sauce or business secrets. I was just asking them to talk about matters of public accountability and business strategy in a country that has the First Amendment to protect your speech. So I would do my best to persuade people. It's a good question because other corporations in their position manage their position differently by trying to have a proactive communication strategy, really recognizing that not everyone is going to see the world as they would wish, but recognizing that if a reasonably balanced, credentialed professional approaches them, whether they're from a journalistic organization or a university or an industry group, and asks for understanding that some corporations say, oh yeah, let's get going. Let's tell you how we see the world. Well, ExxonMobil has a very different view. They basically take all of their decisions on the basis of strict financial interests. And and that's a little bit of an overstatement, but not a lot. And when they think about their communication strategy and their press strategy, I think rather than following some theory that they generally benefit from explaining themselves, or that they have a responsibility to the communities where they operate, the country where they're headquartered, to be an active participant in public life. Rather than that, they ask themselves, what are the cost-benefit equations of cooperating with people like that? And I think the answer that they come to is the costs are higher than the benefits because they operate in controversial settings. They knew that I was interested in their operations in West Africa, where they produced 25% of their oil and gas liquids in the decade after 2000. It's not a pretty picture. Some of the host regimes that they work with have pretty terrible human rights records, or the populations that surround their operations are living in pretty bad conditions. And they might wish for West Africa to be a better place than it is. It would be good for business and good for the people who live there. They're not against that, but they're there as the guests of these host regimes. And if they start telling their story, they're more likely to irritate their host government than they are gain anything in the eyes of, say, American readers about how sophisticated they are.